It's a great pleasure to interview you on your book, The Knowledge Capital of Nations, written with Ludger Fussman. This is a great book that provides a discussion of many, well, I could even say most, of the modern important topics in economics of education. Many people associate education studies with psychology, sociology, pedagogy, and other areas, but not with economics. However, economics and statistics have been highlighting many important issues on education. Well, could you start by explaining to us what's economics of education?
Well, I think the economics of education is trying to understand both how do you produce better outcomes, and when you have better outcomes of schooling, what does that mean for society and the economics of individual labor market outcomes and the economics of nations. And so what we've tried to do in this book is to pull all of these aspects together to get an idea of what things can be done, what policies can be undertaken that would in fact lead to better outcomes.
Well, just at the beginning of your book, you explained that for many years people had trouble studying the relationships between education and economic growth. Why is it so?
Well, I think that we just didn't measure education very well. There was a remarkable work by Jacob Mincer, an economist in the mid 1960s, that suggested that the skills of people paid off in the labor market. And the way he measured skills was to measure how much time people had spent in schools. That was a big jump forward to relate skills to, in fact, the earnings and livelihood of individuals. But it led to a distortion because a year of schooling in one place is not the same as a year of schooling in another place. And it's a matter of knowing what people are learning in their schools. I've gone to a number of developing countries where they have exactly the same amount of time spent in schools as in Portugal or the United States, and see that they aren't learning anything. They can hardly go through the alphabet. Well, this is what has led to a lot of confusion because lacking good measurement, people say, well, let's make sure that everybody gets to college and university, or let's make sure that everybody completes secondary schooling without paying attention to whether they're learning or not. And we know that learning is a cumulative process, so that your ability to do algebra is not just what you learned in middle school or in lower secondary school, and it's what you learned in primary school about the ability to deal with fractions. And if you don't have that basis, you get lower outcomes all along. And so it all builds on each other. And just paying attention to how long somebody's been in school doesn't adequately reflect what they're learning.
Well, after establishing correlations, we have the question of causality, which has been pretty much discussed along decades in sociology and economics. And we know that more developed countries have greater capability for investing in good education. But we also know that an educated population contributes for a country's development. So it seems there is a mutual causality. But we would like to know which is the main factor: education or wealth. And I think that in your book and in your work, you have made very interesting and very important contributions to this discussion. So what are your conclusions after all?
Well, we come out pretty strongly that higher quality schools affects growth and future economic well-being, and not the other way around. It's easy to see the debate, and you have phrased it well. If we look at years of schooling, think of that as something that a country buys, and they get richer and they buy more of everything, including more schooling. And that's what we see around the world, that people buy longer years of schooling. But what we also see around the world. You can see it across the whole European Union. You can see it across all the developed countries, is that just spending more on schools doesn't guarantee that you're going to get more learning. And in fact, there's a wide variation in that. And that's what comes through. One of the ways you can address this issue of causation is to look at what is the impact on growth of just the amount of achievement that's added by the schools. So you look at good school policy that makes achievement go up. Does that contribute to growth? And in fact, you can see it. If you look across countries, you see that countries that are able to add to the quality of their schooling also add to their growth rate, and it's not the other way around.
You also provide measures of impact, which are very interesting because you are very specific. You say that, for instance, by increasing the PISA results of a country by 25 points, which Portugal did since the beginning, and now even more than that. So we could expect an increase in economic activity. But what type of economic growth can we expect from, say, 25 points in PISA?
Well, let's put it in Portuguese terms. If you had a 25-point increase in PISA, say over the next 15 years, you can never change schools immediately. Mm-hmm. And then it takes a while before these kids get into the labor market and so forth and become a large part of the labor force. Taking all that into account and looking at growth over the remainder of this century, on average, Portuguese GDP would be 3% higher. 3% is a big number every year.
It's a big number.
It's a big number, and it's much more important than many of the debates that are going on in your legislature today about budgeting for public programs and so forth. And so we're really talking about quite dramatic changes from what look like feasible changes, and they are feasible changes. We know that it's possible to get 25-point increase in PISA scores. You in Portugal have seen that in the past from just a set of policies of measuring what's going on, holding people accountable, trying to improve school quality, teacher quality, and school quality. You can get 25 points on PISA, and that is really worth it. Now, it's not worth it today because you have to wait till the kids get out into the labor market. But in the long run, that's what's going to affect the development of Portugal or any country.
You point to two contrasting regions in the world, namely South America and East Asia, where things work pretty differently. Could you explain it a little bit better? Because the contrast is sharp.
Sure. Let's move back and imagine that we were looking at the world in 1960. Something that I can do, but you have more difficulty doing.
I'm not. Maybe not.
And if we were looking at 1960 and thinking about which part of the world was going to develop over the next 50 years, we probably would have said that the United States and European countries are more developed than the rest of the world, but who's going to be next? And we might well have picked out Latin America as being the region of the world that's going to move into the highly developed area of Europe and the United States and Canada and so forth. And why would we have said that? Well, they had a reasonable market economy across Latin America in 1960. They had more schooling than other less developed areas of the world in terms of years of schooling. And so they looked like they were primed to, in fact, have the growth that was seen in Europe and North America. And if we contrast that with East Asia, that was far behind in terms of the average years of schooling of the adult population in 1960, and their income levels were, I think, about half of what it was in Latin America. I don't remember the exact figures. And we would have said, well, obviously Latin America is in a better position than East Asia. Well, if I sit here today and look around the world, no one is going to point to the rapid growth of Latin America and how it outstripped East Asia growth, because we've seen throughout East Asia this growth that's been astounding in a number of countries. And here's the point that we've been talking about. It's all linked to the fact that their schooling was much higher quality and has remained much higher quality. If we look at the PISA rankings of countries today, the top end is just packed with East Asian countries that have been able to both expand the amount of schooling of their population, but do it at a high quality level.
And we can see the same within European countries, can't we?
From outside, I mean, Northern European countries have developed more rapidly than Southern European countries. And that in part reflects, or largely, I think, reflects the quality of their schools. And Southern Europe has been struggling to catch up in terms of the quality of schools. I don't know if it's polite to name individual countries, but we know that some of the Southern European countries are not up to the level of Germany or Belgium or Finland, and it also comes through in terms of the development of these countries, their income levels and their growth rates.
So it seems simple. You have to increase the quality of education. Well, but it's not that easy. And let's say people many times discuss this dilemma. Should we increase curricular ambition and have more strict testing, or should we try to raise the level of all students, ensure that those with more difficulties, with whom very often come from disadvantaged backgrounds, don't fail and get proper attention? So this is a question with ethical and pedagogical implications, but just from the point of view we have been discussing, the point of view of economics and of education, what should we do? Should we go for curricular ambition, or should we go to pay attention to the lower ends, cognitively speaking?
Well, the answer is simple: yes. We should do this. We should do both.
Yes means both. Okay.
We should do both. That we know that the top end of the distribution, the scientists and engineers, or what we sometimes refer to as the rocket scientists, are very important in development. They are the ones who help to design the production processes that lead to economic growth. They lead to more efficient production and more output from nations. But at the same time, having a broad base of highly skilled people is also important. And that leads to gains both for those people and for the nations. Importantly, they work together. Rocket scientists can do more if they have a highly skilled population that will implement their ideas and put them in place. And they choose better production processes. They choose ways of doing things that use human capital, that use skilled workers better. And that the combination of the two, I think, is the answer. And so making the choice, what's the example? The example might be contrasting India and China. India has a really well-developed schooling system at the high end. Their IITs produce some of the world's best engineers that we see around Silicon Valley all the time, of the highly skilled Indian engineers. China has worked more at broad-based improvement in their population. They have good schools at the top end too, but they've worked more at also at broadening out their education. And I think in the long run, China is going to come out ahead because they're doing both paying attention to the bottom end, the people that are uneducated and have low quality schooling, but they're also developing the top universities in their nation. And that's going to pay off ahead. And unless India works more at the broad population, they're not going to keep up with China. But that holds for across Europe too. I mean, there are still 20% or plus of the Portuguese population, which according to the PISA results, simply are not internationally competitive in terms of their skills and what they've learned in school. They're in school, but they're not getting skills that are necessary for modern society. That's the same in the US. It's interesting, the US and Portugal are at about the same place, both in terms of overall achievement levels and in terms of the proportion at the bottom end that is not keeping up. And for both countries, dealing with quality across the board is going to be the key.
From your point of view, so from the point of view of an economist of education, can you point out to specific policy measures that are effective for that effect? For instance, should we reduce class size? Should we prepare teachers better? All these type of measures that people usually discuss. Which ones, from your point of view, from the point of view of the studies you have done, which ones should increase better the cognitive level of students?
And it turns out that along the way, the one thing that the researchers have learned, I'm not sure the politicians have entirely learned this, is that how money is spent is often much more important than how much we spend. So if we look down the line, the things that politicians like to talk about are basically resources, class size, how big are the classes, or how many teachers have master's degrees or advanced degrees. And it turns out that the things we know are that these are not consistently related to quality, that lowering class size by itself often doesn't lead to any improvement in quality. It leads to much more expenditure, but not to improving quality. We know that teacher experience, as much as we would like to think is important, has little direct relationship to effectiveness. You can find just about as many highly effective teachers with 20 years of teaching experience as with 1 year of teaching experience. And so investing in the characteristics of the schools isn't important. What is important is paying attention to the outcomes. And so the first policy that I think any country should undertake if they want to improve their schools is to measure where the schools are today, test the students' learning and measure where they're at, because it's hard to improve anything if you don't know where you're at or whether what you do changes where you're at.
Absolutely. And you stress that the accumulation of skills depends on learning early in life. This seems to me a very important idea. However, people talk a lot about lifelong learning and professional development and so on, but you stress the importance of basic education. Is that true?
Absolutely. And Flavio and his co-author Jim Heckman have worked a lot about this idea that education is a cumulative process and it builds on what you knew in the past. And that leads to, some of the things we talked about before of years of schooling not matter if you start with low initial learning. But one of the things that's particularly relevant for Europe, which has a lot more vocational education and training people for specific jobs, is that jobs change. And that's the part of development and growth, is that the character of what people are doing changes and the production changes, and the people have to be able to adjust to the new demands of the labor force. And what basic education and the fundamental skills do for a person is give them the ability to adapt to the future.
What's the scientific evidence about the importance of standardized curriculum-based exams? This is a very debated topic, but from your point of view, from a point of view of an economist and a statistician who studied this from the, let's say, if you studied this looking at the outcomes.
I think the evidence is very clear. Places that have consequential exit exams do better in terms of the quality of their education, in terms of the long run quality of their workers. And I know that testing students and perhaps relating that in an accountability sense to what the schools are doing gets into pretty tense political grounds, but the economic grounds are pretty clear, that testing students to know where they are and holding schools and teachers accountable for the learning that goes on, not necessarily the level of achievement, but how much people learn over time, is a very positive and productive way to improve the schools. And in fact, it's very hard to improve the schools without that.
You have a very recent paper published with Annika Bergbauer and Wassman again on the effect of national testing. With this paper, from what I've read, confirms what you are saying and develops it more. What are the important conclusions of this study that adding to what you already discussed in your book?
Well, I think testing is particularly important for countries that are trying to develop and get better. And
in general, you are saying.
In general, the countries that are at the top of the league tables for PISA don't get much out of introducing more testing and accountability. They already know what they're doing, at least as they're measured. But the countries that are say below the average of the OECD or the European Union can in fact benefit from having added testing and accountability. And I think that's the main message is, and it's standardized testing that allows you to compare across other schools and across the country that are most important. There's lots of testing that goes on in schools. Teachers give tests regularly and examine students, but that can't provide adequate information about how well students are doing
compared with the others, right?
In a global sense, in a larger sense. And in fact, participation in the international test, I think, is also very important because it's no longer the case that you're just competing with the guy in the school next to you. You are, in fact, going to compete with everybody in the world. Labor markets and world economies have become so integrated that your skills depend only on whether you do better than all the other countries that are willing to do the same amount of work that you are, the same kind of work. And so having adequate information, both at the country level and at the local school level, I think is fundamental to anything.
Going back, if I may, to what you just said a minute ago about accountability. So you talk about accountability of schools and teachers, and you expressed this idea, but you didn't say it exactly, the value added in education. And I think you are the creator of this idea. So why is accountability so important, and how we how can we have it on such a complex system as education? Because students are different, student background varies immensely, schools are different, regions are different, everything is different. So how can we have accountability here, and how can we measure the value added?
You've expressed the complexities very well, and they're real. Um, when people talk about testing students and holding teachers or schools accountable for them, there's a natural reaction to that that says, well, if I just get good kids, I'm going to do well. If I get the kids of the highly educated, with highly educated parents that are helping them at home, I'm going to look good because their scores are going to be good. The idea behind value added, though, is to get away from that, to get away from just looking at the overall performance level, which is important. You want to have overall performance, but you only want to hold people accountable for the part that they provide, the amount of education that they provide, the extra, the amount, the value added. And so you want to know, how much did this teacher add over and above what they got from their parents, from their neighbors, from their friends. And the value added measures are trying to, in rough terms, look at the growth in learning over the time that the teacher was important. So if you look at a student in grade 4, you want to know at the end of grade 4, how much do they know compared to what they knew at the beginning of grade 4, and how much did they gain?
And the interest of kids is the purpose of school, right?
Well,
so
that's
school works for kids, although many times we don't think exactly that way. We think about other aspects of schooling, but schools were created for kids and for kids to improve.
Oh, that's absolutely right. But it's so easy to say, I'm doing this for the kids and so forth. And that's why you should pay me more because I'm doing this for the kids, and, we lose track of it. And in fact, if we don't measure what is happening to the kids, it's easy to make the case that I'm doing it for the kids. You can't show that I'm wrong.
Thank you very much, Professor Hanushek. Rick, thank you for this interview. It was really interesting, and I think that our audience is going to appreciate very much your point of view and the explanations you just gave. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Nuno. It's always good talking about this, and jointly, maybe we can get things better in the world.
We hope so. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rick.